They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men, and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now, inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told the secrets and dreams to the first men, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world, until the time came when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of R'lyeh under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. H.P. Lovecraft, The Call of Cthulhu. Chapter 1, The Beginning of the End. As the war between the states began to wind down, I received orders to escort our great captain, General Grant, to Petersburg, Virginia, to accept the surrender of the gentleman general, Robert E. Lee. It was on to mid-March now, the fighting being pretty much concluded, and with the weather being pleasant, my company and myself were light of spirit all of a sudden, almost jovial one could say. We set out on March 15th, scheduled for a 5-day march, beginning at Sailor's Creek and passing the general off to the next unit at a small farm, Wilcox Farm, just north of Petersburg. The trip itself was most uneventful, save for the wonderful conversation I had with the general. He spoke nothing of war and the horrors he had seen. He spoke instead of his childhood, tanning hides and drawing water and the like in his hometown of Georgetown, Ohio. I was too starstruck to offer much in the way of conversation. I let our champion and hero do most of the talking. It was a very pleasant experience. The fifth and final day of the trip was as uneventful as the rest. General Grant awoke early as usual, smoked his cigar while attending to his duties. All in all, this was a favorable experience for myself, and I know that several of my men found the general's very presence bolstering and unifying. He was indeed a mythical figure in all our hearts. It was with those hearts heavy indeed we parted company just after sunset at the Wilcox Farm in Virginia. The general took fresh company the rest of the way to Appomattox, where he would receive the surrender of the Confederate champion and eventually follow his path to the presidency. Wilcox himself found no privilege in hosting us at his place. Indeed, he was a Confederate loyalist and long since dead, so he offered no protest as the men, being relieved of all duties and needing to fill the void left by our general's company, began to descend upon the homestead in search of whatever provisions and entertainment what could be had. Gibson, a large German fellow with red hair and fiery green eyes, managed to produce several jugs of moonshine, much to the delight of others in our unit. A pair of twins from Ripley, Ohio, whose names I confess I never learned, began chopping up furniture with the intent to make a fire. I busied myself looking for something to eat. Most of the farm's livestock had been ravaged long ago, but I was able to locate a significant cache of salt pork, enough we could all eat well this evening. Henry, a runaway slave that had fought with the company before I had taken its command, stopped one of the twins just before they could smash Wilcox's old fiddle. As the sun set, Henry began to play. The fire began to blaze, and salt pork and good moonshine began to flow. Being exhausted and drunk and full for the first time in forever, it wasn't long until soldiers began to wander away from the fire in search of a place to sleep for the night. As all the furniture had either been looted or chopped up for firewood, most of the men set to the barn with the notion of sleeping on the hay. After days and days of sleeping out on the ground, the Wilcox barn looked better than almost anything. The last thing I heard before drifting off to sleep was Henry playing Whiskey in the Jar while the twins sang along in harmony. It was a great way to spend the end of the war. Chapter 2, What Dreams May Come. It wasn't until some time after that I began to understand the magnitude of what happened to us that night after we went to sleep. As the fire burned low, one of the twins noticed something inside the flames. In their haste, they had begun burning a box without inspecting its contents. There appeared to be some sort of stone inside the box. Considering it might have some monetary value, it was subsequently drawn from the fire. Strangely, the stone showed no signs of smoke or heat damage. Indeed, to the touch, it was quite cool. There was a figure carved into the stone, but it was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. The creature seemed to be some sort of monster or representation of a monster, a cross between some sort of dragon and octopus, with the eyes that seemed to stare off into the void of forever. Its vicious head sat atop a grotesque and scaly set of tentacles, surrounded by what looked like folded wings. It was a thing most unsettling, but the twins felt like it was almost certainly of great value, so it went to the barn with them at the end of the evening. Sleeping it with between them made for a ghastly sight. That night we dreamed. Not in the sense that each man was at rest and find pleasant sleep. No, we dreamed together, each of us the same dream, present in the other man's vision all at once. The dream began in the air, flying over a great unknowable cyclopean city. Each building soared into the sky, unimaginably large, filling the land below with a tapestry of streets, all paved between the giant buildings. What looked to be ancient hieroglyphics, stricken with irregular and heavy strokes, adorned walls and pillars in the vast city. As we slowed our descent to the city floor, I could now observe the structures in more detail. The titanic blocks and far-flung monoliths were all covered in some horrible green ooze that pulsed and dripped in terrifying display. As I approached an entrance in one of the immense structures, I could feel the ooze pulsing inside my temples, with the words Cthulhu Batagan repeating over and over again in my mind. As I crossed the threshold into what looked to be a temple of some kind, my heart raced with fear and dread. Inside I could see no roof. The walls extend to what must be miles and miles above the gritty stone floor. Indeed, the light could not make it to the top or is the bottom of such a large chasm. I had the terrible notion that there was something up there, something flying just above where the light touched, something big and dead and dreaming. Against my own will, my feet carried me deeper into the temple. My head positively throbbed with the ooze and drum beats, but the words had changed. Now a magnitude of voices chanting in unison could distinctly be heard with two words, neither of which I could assign any meaning. The first word left over from the first incarnation was Cthulhu. The second new word was R'lyeh, or some variation thereof. I never heard this language before and was beyond certain it was of no European dialect. As the rear wall became visible, I observed a familiar sight. There, placed upon what could be described as a plain bas-relief altar, was the carved stone we found in Wilcox's belongings. The creature carved into the stone was glowing, a sickeningly green glow that looked like it would burn your hand if one were to touch it. Above me, in the darkness, I could hear something moving. A warm breeze washed upon my face, but I felt all the sicker for it. The air was foul with a rank stench, a stench that was very familiar to any soldier. It was the unmistakable smell of death, sweet and terrible and all-consuming. The stone idol was now rocking in its place, the green glow intensifying. Now I could hear the chants, Cthulhu, R'lyeh, both inside and outside my head. My eyes wandered up once again to the infinite dark hole above me. Shadows moved and a giant tentacle shot forth from the darkness. It made its way down the wall, leaving a trail of green ooze everywhere it touched. The stench was overpowering now, filling all my senses with the thickness of it. I wondered how such a space and such a thing could come to exist. A moment later, I was shocked back into the present reality. I sat bolt upright to find myself back in Wilcox's barn. Several soldiers were already awake, pale-faced and sweaty. Several others shot up as well, each with the unmistakable look of terror upon their face. Those of us that were able to speak confirmed that we had all had the same experience flying through the cyclopean city. The twins, still holding their precious stone, would never wake again. Chapter 3, After the War. The rest of my commission continued on without incident. After that evening, we returned from whence we came, Sailor's Creek. We never spoke of the night again to each other. We just marched on. What was one more in a sea of green horrors? With my military career behind me, I returned to Kentucky and began crafting barrels for a local cooperage. I found that toiling with my hands on such a fine product would keep my mind off the war and the cyclopean city and the foul thing that lurked in the shadows above, or was it below? Gibson, the large German fellow from my unit, and I began a correspondence. We never discussed the war that night on Wilcox's farm. He had taken a job loading freight onto riverboats on the Ohio River, work he found both rewarding and financially lucrative. On occasion, my work would take me into the city of Louisville, a major shipping port for whiskey and, by extension, the barrels that I would craft. We made plans to meet at a bar downtown, to catch up, and to see if seeing the other man after such a long interval would prove as rewarding as we hoped. It was a hot day in June, with the heat already high before the sun rose, that I made my way to our appointment. We met at a small tavern not far from the riverfront. We sat outside as the sun began to set, both of us sweating in the hot Kentucky summer. I will admit it was good to see him once again. Gibson had always been a good soldier, and I had liked him instantly. He was still tall and brawny, hair flaming as red as the day we last saw each other. I had aged twice as fast, it seemed, my thinning gray hair gone long ago. We spoke of family and career and continued to drink. After some time, we arrived on the subject of the war and the night at Wilcox's farm. He asked me if I had remembered what happened that evening, and I admitted that I still did. He told a story about how a Dutch East India trading ship was blown off course east of Australia. A whaling ship spotted the wreckage from some distance and closed on the ship. When they boarded the vessel, they were privy to absolute horror. Of the 45 officers and crew members scheduled aboard the Cheyenne, only one man still lived. He lay unconscious on the deck with the slain bodies of the crew all about. The man was covered in gore, was completely unresponsive, and in his hand clutched a stone idol. They brought him aboard the whaling ship, keeping him under strict supervision during the entirety of his stay there. He never regained consciousness, but he would mumble incoherently from time to time. One of the men took the stone from his hands and began to inspect the idol. The piece he described was identical to the stone idol we had found during our stay at Wilcox Farm. Gibson said he was planning a trip to Sydney and to try and find the stone. He invited me along with the notion that the two of us would be able to procure the item and do what with it he did not say. I don't know why I accepted his invitation, but I did outright without a second thought. My business in Kentucky would have to wait. We would be leaving for New Orleans and then later be bound for Australia. Chapter 4. The Alert. We found ourselves able to book passage aboard the steamer, the Bream, bound for New Orleans by way of Pittsburgh. Gibson had worked for the captain frequently and was able to secure our transport at no cost. She was to be docked in Louisville for about 48 hours, a time in which she would unload some cargo and take on some other goods as the industry goes. Gibson and I brought our meager belongings on board one hot July evening. Even though the sun had set, the oppressive humidity hung thick in the air, as thick as the mosquitoes from the putrid Ohio riverbank. The Bream was a tiny vessel by the standards of the day and river. It couldn't have weighed more than 75 tons at most. Her ship and crew made their living transporting cargo in peacetime, ordnance during wartime, and had been running this route ever since 1815. Small but extravagant, she had silver pins instead of iron pegs. The ship had no guest quarters or staterooms. There was simply a cot on the floor and a hammock in the adjacent corner of the cargo hold that would serve as our lodge during the 10-day voyage to New Orleans. This would prove to be the most comfortable part of our journey, a time I now cherish in great regard. Arriving at the port of New Orleans was an incredible experience. While Louisville had been a bustling town, New Orleans was a powder keg constantly exploding. One of the local parishes had flooded during a hurricane and was now burdening the rest of its city with its remains. Ships that had been anchored were converted into floating tenement buildings, creating rank conditions for the entire dock. Typhoid fever and malaria ran rampant through the city. Rats seemed to grow as big as dogs and would approach children on the street. Just under the surface, you could feel the scars left by the Great War, and while there was some progress in rebuilding the city both physically and culturally, violent outbursts in the name of racial intolerance were still the norms for its citizens. Gibson said he had heard of only one ship that sailed in the direction we were inclined to travel, the Alert, a ship with a history of its own. Originally constructed by Confederate shipmakers in Savannah, the Alert was built to last. Clad in iron, powered by steam, and boasting a massive set of sails, she had made her way up and down the Mississippi, transporting what precious few troops and resources the South could muster. Unfortunately, her durability led to her downfall, as the Confederate Navy was unable to sink her before Union troops could capture the vessel. The Alert was the only Confederate steamer captured during the war. Her primary and secondary guns were confiscated, leaving her in flute for the remainder of her commission. After the war ended, Union sailors brought her to the port of New Orleans, where she gathered prisoners of war and returned them to St. Louis, a route she continued to take for the next several years. The Union Navy decommissioned her in 1875, after which she was sold to a private investor. From that point on, her tale is a mystery. Several changes in captain has left the ship's log incomplete and incoherent. With this in mind, we boarded the Alert without a second thought. Our journey would take us from the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic, then another 25 days to the port of Bahia Blanca, the shimmering white bay of Argentina. Chapter 5. La Rose. It was early August when we departed the city. The sky was pink even though it was hours before dawn that morning. A series of fires that had begun on the docks had now spread to some of the city's interior structures. Alarms sounded and the city plunged into chaos as we slowly pulled the anchor and backed away from the dock. Part of our contract with the Alert was that we were to work alongside the rest of the crew during our part of the journey. We ate mess with the other sailors, usually a savage biscuit called hardtack, but always with plenty of rum. Most of our duties were limited to cleaning the decks and rails, endless work that left the back sore and knuckles raw. I remember scrubbing one set of railings for nearly 8 hours with limited progress. It was as if the barnacles had grown a ship, not the other way around. We slept alongside the crew as well in a cargo hold that had been converted to barracks. The irony that the ship had once been used to transport Union prisoners of war was now my primary means of subsistence was not lost upon me. Routine is a way of taking the edge off most every experience. It wasn't long until Gibson and I found ourselves completely engulfed by life at sea aboard the Alert. 35 days after we pulled anchor, we sailed into port at Bahia Blanca in Argentina. The captain went ashore immediately upon our arrival on different errands. We were instructed to be ready to depart in 3 days' time, and the rest was up to us. After changing the cargo and loading fresh water into the bay below, Gibson and I decided to leave the ship and see the city. This would be our last stop at civilization for some time, so we endeavored to find a hot meal and strong drink before departure. We settled upon a small place not far from our dock, Hilgueo, because the tavern looked inviting in the setting sun. The beaches of Bahia Blanca were well covered in white sand, and the white beechwood the local used to front their shops gave the entire place an ethereal appearance. We ordered around and made our way to the wooden booth beside the main bar. I myself spoke no Spanish, but Gibson was able to communicate in a mixture of German, Italian, and French, and he was eventually able to order dinner along with our drinks. While we waited for our dinner, we overheard an old sailor at the bar. He was white, wearing green breeches and a coat and cravat that looked very out of place given the August heat. His entire persona seemed to defy the bar and its surroundings. Here was a relic from the past, sitting in contemporary state. Gibson grabbed his beer and started for the empty seat next to the old man. I followed. When he spoke, it was in heavy accented French, accented even heavier by the booze. "I know what you boys seek, why you've come so far yet to go." His eyes were wet and watery, as if he was peering from below the sea surface. "Truth be told, you should turn back now, and forget this fool's errand. Try to live your life to please the Almighty." At this, the old man crossed himself in the Catholic style. "But you won't listen. They never do. So I'll tell you this instead. Pick one. Choose now. It would be easier for the both of you later." We both looked at him in bewilderment. He said nothing more, just drank his beer and gazed into the eternal void beyond it. Gibson and I spoke not of the old man or his warning that night or any other. After we finished, we paid our tab and the old man's before heading back to the ship. Chapter 6, The Straits of Magellan. An odd hush had fallen over the crew as we made our final preparations to leave Argentina. While they had never been what you'd call a merry bunch, conversation had now ceased altogether, and it made the toiling seem twice as hard. I busied myself about my chores aboard. Gibson, being a good sailor, followed suit, but indeed the whole business seemed dark and heavy now. Turning westward, we began our journey through the Straits of Magellan. Good sailors wishing to pass from the Atlantic to the Pacific were apt to sail the strait. The Spanish were the first Europeans to chart the narrow rocky water separating mainland South America from the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego. Despite its shallow passes and endless rocky coastline, the strait offered much better travel than the Cape Horn Passage, beset by icebergs and harsh Arctic storms. It was with steamers blowing and sails full displayed we entered the rocky pass. During the day, a squall blew up from the cold southern Arctic, soaking the crew and leaving icicles as long as a man's arm, hugging railings, ballasts, anything exposed, including the sailors themselves. Freezing wind made the waves choppy, and the captain swore profusely as we narrowly missed a rock sitting ominously below the surface. For what seemed like weeks, we fought the rough seas and choppy water. Finally, the western shoreline of South America could be seen with the naked eye, and beyond the rocky shoreline lay the gentle Pacific Ocean. Suddenly, one of the crew members began shouting and pointing down the starboard side of the ship. He was soon joined by a large number of sailors, also pointing and shouting. Gibson and I arrived at the scene just in time to see what looked like a canoe of native peoples heading for the shoreline away from the ship. The first and third man in the boat held oars, though God knows how they'd made a row for it in such frigid rocky water. The man in the middle was standing, naked from the waist up and painted red. Along the side of the Alert was painted a large red draconic figure, not that dissimilar from the figure on the stone we saw. There was no time to consider the implications of such actions, however. The intensity of the storm was increasing and the captain was calling all hands with renewed energy and sense of urgency. As we scrambled for the deck, I thought I could see a fire on the southern coast. I thought that I heard drum beats as well, but the ferocity of the storm made it impossible to be sure. We all held the lines as the wind carried us beyond the strait and into the Pacific. The crew breathed an audible sigh of relief. The storm had also begun to subside. This was supposed to be the longest and most peaceful part of our journey. Seems some things don't always work out like they're supposed to. Chapter 7: The Mouth of Madness. We made our way swiftly westward after clearing the straits. Indeed, the crew began to shift into a vigor. Men flung lines they once barely pulled. Some of the crew began to sing shanties on board. Wine was brought out at dinner on the evening of the third day. It had been since the port on the other side of the strait since the men had seen any liquor. The sight was welcome indeed. Along with the wine came a stranger at the dinner. Surely Gibson and I had met everyone that was aboard by now, but apparently we had missed this young Spaniard. He was wild of hair and of eye. His thick, dark curls mopped about his head in an almost jovial way. His eyes shared none of that joy, though. Indeed, he looked like a man deep in thought. He wore not the typical garb of sailors that day. Instead, he had a heavy cloak that must have been a burden to walk about with on board. He made no eye contact with myself nor Gibson. He just sat at the head of the table and bowed his head. Having been sober for days on end, the wine took over quickly. I was no sooner about to stand and leave the table when I found myself on my back, staring at the ceiling, unable to right myself. There was some commotion at the table around where Gibson had been sitting. Was he blind drunk like I was? At present, there was no way of knowing. The room was quickly headed towards darkness. Was that Gibson being drug out of the room by several of the sailors? Nothing seemed to matter anymore, as the darkness consumed me entirely. Some time later, a time only known to the indifferent stars above, I woke on the galley floor. The dining hall was completely empty now, and no plate or fork had been removed from the table. Worse yet, it appeared that someone had been dragged from the table up the stairs towards the deck. I took a step towards the door but stumbled. Whatever was causing such vertigo was strong but wearing off fast. I seemed to recall Gibson being taken from the room, the Spaniard stranger trailing behind the others. The stairs were almost impossible to navigate. They would sway one way only to be thrown the next in an instant. The choppy seas and searing headache proved to be a toxic combination, and I had to pause to vomit on the steps. This felt like the lowest moment of my existence. Fear and despair set in and began to work me over. Not since the first days of the war, when the munitions burst overhead, had I felt such fear. I finally began to approach the top deck. The scene above was horrific as the scene below. The sky was cast in sickly green, drawn even deeper by dark clouds moving quickly my way. The aft section of the Alert looked abandoned, but I could hear some activity from the fore. My eyes followed the rail towards a scene of most rare horrors. There was a giant dark figure looming towards the boat. Nothing on God's earth was created so big in such a monstrous way. I knew this figure was no terrestrial being. On the front of the boat gathered a group of sailors and the young Spaniard from dinner. They were all facing the creature, chanting in some foreign tongue I could not understand. I was so dumbstruck by the entire scene, I shudder to recall the events even now in the safety of my own home. The figure was now almost directly overhead. Its shadow swallowed the entire boat, and the chanting grew to a deafening roar. Cthulhu Raya, over and over again. Cthulhu Raya, Cthulhu Raya. Gibson. They had Gibson and were lifting him towards the giant looming creature. I shouted his name and made straight away for the group. I'm not sure what I intended to do. They were many sailors strong, and I was of no condition to put up such an insurrection, but on I went. I was easily dispatched the moment they were alerted to my presence. I did manage one good punch on the first fellow, right across his chin, but there was no second punch. My hands had arms and legs now, and I could fight no more, only gape at the incredible sight that was about to unfold before me. Chapter 8: Horror. Struggled as best I could, but in the end all my efforts were in vain. They held me captive and did as they were to do anyway. They raised Gibson higher still. The creature loomed full now over the boat, and I could observe it in some detail. A giant squid-like face peered down at the mortals in the boat. It had tentacles, each one impossibly long, that swayed effortlessly about. Two monstrous eyes fixed Gibson, and he ceased fighting his captors. The creature leaned in, wrapped a tentacle around Gibson's midsection, and proceeded to lift him from the Alert. The sailors gasped, Gibson screamed, and I almost fainted. The Spaniard had cast his hood aside and was standing at the edge of the boat stiff-armed, as if he meant to hug the monstrous being. I had figured Gibson for dead. The sense of fear and dread had grown completely consumed my mind. As I watched Gibson and the creature, I knew this would be the end for us both. Gibson was raised to eye level. He stopped shouting and locked eyes with it, and then it was quickly over. The massive tentacle lowered Gibson back to the throng of frenzied sailors. They received Gibson with delicacy and delight. He was quickly taken on board, downstairs, and from where that I could not tell. I was struck in the face and left unconscious for the second time in a single evening on the deck floor. When I woke again, we had just made landfall. I must have been out for quite some time. Half my face was parched from the sun and sea, and my body ached all over. I was ready for this adventure to find its conclusion. Movement caught the corner of my eye. The sailors were dragging Gibson down the gangplank towards shore. I followed but kept my distance, eager to not make the same mistake again. This was no port I had seen before, not really a port at all, just a dock and a dirt path through the bush. Judging by the floor, I was somewhere in eastern Australia. No time to investigate. I limped along quietly as I could behind Gibson's captors. Chapter 9. The worst is yet to come. Eventually, the soft beach sand gave way to a much harsher scrub brush, though I could still hear the ocean distinctly on my right. I was feeling somewhat better. I could walk without too much discomfort, but still had no ambitions to harass the sailors again. I would bide my time, wait for just the right moment, then spring Gibson from his prison. Up ahead, a fire pierced the darkness. There appeared to be a large structure, a seaside chapel of sorts, though no steeple rose into the night sky. There were double doors flung open wide, and inside throngs of followers in green robes were chanting Cthulhu R'lyeh. Once the sailors were in sight of the chapel, they began to shout and dash towards the building. The members inside stopped their rhythmic recitation and headed for the door to glimpse the incoming party. Everyone all at once there was shouting, and I got the sense that a great celebration was about to commence. I followed along silently in the shadows. Long forgotten was the original errand our trip was set for, but in an odd set of circumstances we were much closer than we knew to our purpose. With so much activity, I lost track of Gibson. There were so many bodies moving so fast, I slipped in with the last group of sailors and was able to be among them without alerting suspicion. We entered the seaside chapel, now filled again with the devoted and sailors alike. Thankfully, it was standing room only. I found a place to stand near the door in case a hasty exit would be needed. The room fell silent. It was obvious a ceremony was about to commence. The Spaniard from the boat appeared at the front of the pulpit. There was about a dozen rows of ancient pews between him and I, but I knew it was him, no doubt. Those dark curls and black eyes were unmistakable. He began to chant Cthulhu R'lyeh, and soon the entire congregation, including myself, was joining him. From behind the Spaniard, a door opened. About half a dozen Denzins, clad in green robes, supported another figure in a much more ornate dress. It seemed apparent that this person was the reason for our gathering here in some uncharted island off the coast of Western Australia. The Spaniard had disappeared behind his own robe and in a moment returned, this time with what appeared to be a large stone cupped in both hands. Surely the fate mocked Gibson and I. It was the very stone we'd set to find. Here it was, mere feet away, but as unavailable as it ever was. The ornately robed figure was laid on the altar for all to see. The Spaniard began to pass the stone over his body, and the figure began to writhe with agony. The figure began to stir, got to its feet, then cast off its robe. It was Gibson, of course, now racked with pain by some unseen tormentor. A great transformation began before us. What had been Gibson's lower jaw was now jutting at an impossibly long angle, turning green, and appeared to be growing other tentacles from its base. Gibson stood, his eyes shocked in absolute horror, looking to the congregation for sympathy or mercy perhaps, but there was none to be had. The transformation continued. His fingers were turning into tentacles as well, and now he was gaining in both size and mass. He staggered towards the rear door of the chapel, and the onlookers cheered with an intoxicating glee. Once Gibson cleared the chapel doors, he was completely unrecognizable as a human. His pink flesh had turned green, and tentacles sprang from both his face and appendages. He was surely 12 feet tall or more, and looked to weigh an incredible amount as he drug himself across the brush. The onlookers followed and celebrated with shouts and chants of Cthulhu R'lyeh. The creature turned to face the crowd one last time when he arrived at the beach. The Spaniard stepped forth and presented the stone to what had been Gibson. A green tentacle slithered around the token and brought it up to some horrible unseen fold. Gibson turned towards the sea and walked into the water until he vanished. All the revelry had gone from the crowd. They began to depart, joyless and lethargic. Chapter 10. End of the Beginning. The group dispersed quickly. I was able to follow the sailors at a comfortable pace. All the vigor had been drained by the ceremony we just witnessed. Eventually, we happened upon a small port village by the name of Hobart. Seems we had actually come ashore south of the mainland, on another island the locals called Tasmania. Being broke and completely destitute, I went in search of mercy. Father Robert Knopwood from St. Peter's Church found me sleeping outside the Abbey one dreadful evening and thankfully brought me inside. I spent several days in the care of Father Knopwood and the gentlemen from Hobart Catholic Young Men's Society. They nursed me back to health, got me on my feet, even helped me make arrangements with a local whaling vessel, the Toca, to transport me as far as Baja Blanca, the shimmering white bay of Argentina. The journey eastward was completely uneventful. I stayed in my cabin during the off hours, transcribing the events detailed here. The work on board was grueling, but it kept my mind off the events that had just transpired. My hair, once a healthy chestnut, had gone white after the shock of the creature in the sea. Still, I was able to make a tidy sum among the token, and then I left the crew at Baja Blanca. My pockets were heavy with coin. I headed for El Gallo the moment my feet hit the shore, curious to see if LaRose was still there and what perspectives he could offer. He was sitting at the bar when I walked in, same place, drink untouched on the counter. I sat beside him without saying a word. The bartender came to our congregation, and I ordered a drink. That's where I sit now, dear reader, silently next to LaRose. We both know of the horrors that exist and the madness they cause. What we wait for, I'm not sure. Perhaps another group of idealistic sailors, maybe the young dark Spaniard. I'm not sure what we would do if either appeared.